He was the man who made the guitar scream in ways nobody thought possible. The man who built his own instruments from scratch, rewired amplifiers in his garage, and then walked on stage and made every other guitarist in the world feel like they needed to go back to square one. Eddie Van Halen didn't just play guitar, he reinvented it. And he did it with a grin so wide, so warm, so genuinely joyful, that audiences couldn't help but fall completely in love with him. But here's the thing about Eddie Van Halen that most people never fully understood. Behind that infectious smile and those mind-bending solos, there was a deeply sensitive man. A man who had grown up worshiping his heroes. A man who had sat alone in his bedroom in Pasadena for hours on end, needle on the record, trying to decode the magic of the guitarists who came before him. And that sensitivity, that deep burning love for music and for the men who made it, meant that when his heroes disappointed him, when rivals dismissed him, or when peers stole from him, it didn't just sting. It cut him to the bone. Today, we're going inside the rivalries, the feuds, the cold encounters, and the complicated emotions that followed Eddie Van Halen through his legendary career. These are the 6 guitarists Eddie Van Halen couldn't stand, and the surprising, deeply human stories behind every single one of them. Before there was Eruption, before the sold-out arenas, before the Frankenstrat and the Brown sound and the screaming teenage fans, there was a skinny kid in Pasadena, California, sitting cross-legged on his bedroom floor with a cheap guitar across his lap and a stack of Cream records beside him. That kid was Eddie Van Halen, and the man he was trying to imitate night after night, hour after hour, was Eric Clapton. Clapton wasn't just an influence on the young Eddie. He was everything. He was the reason Eddie picked up a guitar in the first place. In his own words, spoken to Guitar World, Eddie described it with a kind of reverence most people reserve for religious figures. Clapton was my main influence. I used to sit there for hours trying to figure out what he was doing. I'd play that solo on Crossroads note for note. He was God to me. Think about what that means. Not just an influence. Not just a favorite player. God. That's the level of devotion Eddie brought to his study of Clapton's playing. The way Clapton phrased a note. The way he let a string bend hang in the air just a half-second longer than anyone expected. The way silence was just as powerful as sound in his hands. All of that became part of Eddie's musical DNA before he ever wrote a single riff of his own. And then, by the late 1970s, something extraordinary happened. Eddie Van Halen did something that even Eric Clapton hadn't done. He reinvented the electric guitar from the ground up. When Eruption exploded out of speakers across the world in 1978, it didn't sound like an evolution of what came before. It sounded like it had arrived from a completely different dimension. Two-handed tapping, harmonic squeals, dive bombs that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Suddenly, the shy kid from Pasadena was the future of rock guitar. Not everyone was celebrating, though. The old guard, the very men Eddie had idolized, listened with a coolness that bordered on dismissal. And in 1980, the man Eddie had called God delivered a verdict that broke his heart wide open. When asked about Van Halen, Eric Clapton said, with the casual indifference of a man commenting on the weather, "He's very good technically, but I don't hear much soul." Those words landed like a punch Eddie never saw coming. Years later, he admitted the full weight of it. It kind of broke my heart. I learned everything from him. I wasn't trying to outplay him. I was inspired by him. To hear that he didn't like what I was doing really got to me. Eddie never fired back. He never called Clapton out in interviews or tried to publicly humiliate him. But privately, he wrestled with it. The sting of being rejected by the man who had lit the flame inside him was unlike anything rivalry could produce. It was something closer to grief. The two men finally met in Los Angeles in the mid-1980s. Eddie went into that meeting with the excitement of a fan seeing his hero for the first time. What he found was a man who was polite but emotionally distant. They talked about guitars and amps, but not about music in the way Eddie had hoped. Not about feeling or passion, or the fire that had once burned on those old Cream records. Afterwards, Eddie told a close friend something that revealed exactly how much he had grown in that moment. "He's just a man. I think I love the myth more than the person." That was the turning point. It was the moment Eddie stopped seeing his heroes as gods and started seeing them as human beings, brilliant, complicated, and flawed. In later years, his feelings about Clapton softened into something more nuanced. "If Clapton hadn't existed, neither would I," he said. "Whatever he thinks of me doesn't change that." Two guitar gods. Two entirely different worlds. Clapton painted with blues and shadows, every note steeped in restraint and tradition. Eddie splashed neon across the sky, fearless and incandescent. The fact that one gave birth to the other, and then couldn't understand what it had created. That's a story as old as art itself. If Clapton was Eddie's first love, then Ritchie Blackmore was the haunted dream that followed. Eddie grew up studying Blackmore's work with Deep Purple and Rainbow, like a scholar studying ancient texts. Burn, Highway Star. He played them until his fingers bled. He admired the precision, the drama, the sense that every note Blackmore played was exactly the right note in exactly the right place. So when Van Halen's debut album exploded in 1978 and Eddie suddenly found himself standing alongside the men he'd grown up worshiping, the moment he'd dreamed of was finally within reach. He could meet Ritchie Blackmore, not as a fan, but as a peer. What happened instead was one of the most deflating experiences of his career. In a 1982 interview with guitar players Jazz Obrecht, Eddie described their first encounter with quiet devastation. "He just stared at me. Wouldn't say, hi, nothing. I was crushed. I thought, wow, I looked up to this guy my whole life, and he just blew me off." That silence hit Eddie harder than any insult. He wasn't an arrogant rock star looking for validation. He was an open, warm, genuinely enthusiastic human being who wanted nothing more than a moment of connection with someone he had admired his entire life. Instead, he got a blank stare and nothing else. Years later, he returned to the memory. "People like Joe Perry and Ritchie Blackmore just gave me the shaft with their eyes," he told Rock and Roll Garage. "Wouldn't say hello. Wouldn't be nice. No, nothing. I'm not that way." That phrase, "the shaft with their eyes," is one of the most precise descriptions of a certain kind of dismissal that exists in the English language. It wasn't even active hostility. It was something worse. Complete indifference from men who Eddie believed should have recognized a kindred spirit. Part of the problem, in fairness, was just who Ritchie Blackmore was as a person. He was famously difficult, even with his own bandmates. His entire mystique was built on distance and unpredictability. And when asked years later about Van Halen, his response was perfectly ambiguous. "He's a fine player, but I think he plays too many notes." Was it jealousy? Generational snobbery? Probably a little of both. Blackmore's style was rooted in classical phrasing and deliberate restraint. Eddie's was explosive, unbound, and almost recklessly free. Where Ritchie crafted control, Eddie embodied liberation. They were both geniuses, but they were speaking completely different languages. By 1995, Eddie had found enough peace with the memory to look back with generosity. "I was probably just too sensitive back then. Maybe he was shy or didn't know what to say. But man, I worshipped that guy growing up. Still do." And eventually, Ritchie softened too. In 2008, he told Classic Rock magazine that what Eddie did with the whammy bar and two-handed tapping was genuinely clever, that he had found his own voice. It was the recognition Eddie had once desperately hoped for, arriving decades late, but arriving nonetheless. The year is 1978. Van Halen is the new thunderstorm rolling across rock skyline. The debut album is shaking radio stations from coast to coast. And Eddie Van Halen, barely 23 years old, is doing what he always did, playing with everything he had every single night, for any crowd willing to listen. But behind the amps and the flashing lights and the roaring audiences, something quietly stung him. The cold indifference of the men he'd grown up idolizing. Men like Joe Perry of Aerosmith. In a 1982 guitar player interview with Jazz Obrecht, Eddie described it plainly. "People like Joe Perry would just give me the shaft with their eyes. Wouldn't say hello. Wouldn't be nice. No, nothing. I'm not that way." He felt it. He felt the chill radiating off these veterans. And he understood what was underneath it. They wouldn't go out of their way to help anybody because they would feel threatened, he said. It wasn't a bitter accusation. It was an honest reading of what was happening in rock music at the end of the 1970s. A new generation was arriving, and the old guard wasn't entirely comfortable with what it saw. Perry's world was built on riff-heavy grooves, raw swagger, and the thick, swampy sound of American hard rock at its most unapologetic. Eddie's world was something else entirely, a future that hadn't existed before he created it. Two-handed tapping, harmonic squeals, a relationship with the whammy bar that had never been explored at that level. To some veterans, it didn't feel like evolution. It felt like an invasion. But here's what makes the story of Eddie Van Halen so extraordinary. Even in moments of genuine hurt, he never let bitterness poison his relationship with music. He once said, with a simplicity that carried enormous depth, "I don't give a fuck if I'm playing a Holiday Inn lounge. I enjoy playing." That was Eddie. He played for the sheer joy of it, not for approval, not for status, not for the validation of men who wouldn't look his way. And, as often happens when ego finally gets out of the way and the music is allowed to speak for itself, Joe Perry eventually came around. In 2013, he looked back with open admiration. Eddie's playing was just phenomenal. He took everything that he'd heard and put his own stamp on it. I thought, oh my God, this is great. He reinvented guitar playing. He described hearing Van Halen's debut album for the first time and being completely floored. "I was blown away," he admitted. "I kept going back to figure out those little tricks and things, the sound, the energy. It was just so different." For Eddie, that belated respect came too late to erase the sting of those early years. But it spoke volumes about his impact. Even those who had turned away had no choice but to eventually turn back. This one is a little different. This isn't a story about cold shoulders or childhood heroes who failed to live up to their mythology. This one is about something Eddie Van Halen held sacred above almost everything else: originality. It was the late 1970s. Van Halen and Boston were sharing a bill, two of America's biggest new rock acts on the same stage. Eddie finished his solo, the crowd still roaring, the adrenaline still electric in the air. And then Tom Scholz stepped up and played Eddie's solo. Years later, Eddie recalled it with a mixture of disbelief and barely contained irritation. Tom Scholz from Boston: "We played right before them, I forget where, and I do my solo. And then all of a sudden he does my solo. It was real weird because it was a daytime thing. I was standing on stage and the whole crowd was looking